Power on.
It's Fighter Renegades, a Star Wars podcast.
Woo! It is good to be back, baby. It has been a little while since we have done a TIE Fighter Renegades, and you'll pardon me if we do this one. You know, we're just going to kind of hang loose on this one and going to have some decaf here, or what did they call it in Star Wars back in the day? Used to call it calf, or if it specifically had caffeine, I think they called it stim calf. Was that it? Man, I missed that. Hold on. Let me have the sip. Good stuff. I missed that when Star Wars used to come up with like what was it, Fumarellos or whatever, for cigars. Or as a cigar, a Fumarello was Battlestar Galactica. Galactica did the same thing. I love that when science fiction was trying to say, it's like, okay, yeah, we have humans here, but they're not from Earth, so we got to make them say some things differently. I don't know. I always dug that. I think Battlestar Galactica, the original one, the one that was actually good, from the 70s, did a much better job of that, like coming up with their own time units and everything, which, again, I think only makes sense. But Star Wars certainly tried its hand at it, and not just in the 70s or 80s either. It's easy to think of like the Brian Daley, like the Han Solo trilogy from Brian Daley, not the A.C. Crispin Han Solo trilogy, which is still an absolute classic. Some of the best Star Wars books ever written. Unfortunately, they're not canon anymore, but don't worry, we're going to talk about canon here. But also, what was it? Was it L. Neil Smith that wrote the Lando Calrissian trilogy back in the day? Anyway, great shit. But it was also done by who we actually are here to talk about, both canon and in person, or in personhood, that being, I would argue, one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time. Now, I mean, there's at least 100 to 200 people in that number, but I really do give it to this guy. Because it goes far beyond his work in Star Wars. Of course, people want to debate back and forth whether or not Star Wars should actually be considered science fiction. It should be fantasy, should be space, whatever. Okay. I like to put it very much in the science fiction camp. Or at least I feel like with the prequels that George Lucas was really trying to guide them more in that direction as compared to, so much fantasy. But then I guess Disney, kind of went in the other direction. But fortunately, as much as Disney has wiped out, by wiping out the expanded universe, fortunately they were very wise in working with some of the legends, no pun intended, working with some of the legends of Star Wars past. And I do think it was very wise of them to work with Timothy Zahn in the new canon, ever since Disney took over in 2013, starting off with the novel Heir to the Jedi. Actually, I think the new canon officially started with a short story in Star Wars Insider, but that's besides the point. So now you may be noticing that I am not saying that I am joined by my man, Robin Freebeard. This is just going to be a solo offing on my part. Rob will be back in full swing in very short order once we have new episodes coming. I mean, we're going to be talking about Book of Boba Fett. We have a whole slew of subjects to get into, and we're excited to do it. It's one of my favorite things to do is to work with Rob on anything, and really just to talk to him. But the fact that we get to work together and talk together, about one of our favorite things, that being Star Wars, well, life gets pretty good sometimes. So anyway, but this is just a solo offing on my part. You're going to get a couple more of these where I am covering topics that, and I had hinted at this in December of 2021 that I would be doing these just because there's things that I consume and take in that for very good reason, and you may think so also after I'm done with this review, that for very good reason, Rob doesn't want to waste his time, and boy, I don't blame him. But me, I walk the earth with this terrible sense of completionism, and so I take it all, baby. Anyway, and what I took all of here, well, it's what we're going to get into, and I'm actually going to cover the entire trilogy, even though Rob and I had discussed at least the first book in this trilogy previously. And what I'm talking about, what I'm reviewing here, and there will be some spoilers, because ultimately, if you feel like you don't need to read these, don't. and I'll give you the cliff notes of what matters that happens within these books. And what we're talking about is Timothy Zahn's, which again went on this whole tangent about how he's one of the greatest science fiction authors ever, in my opinion. And I mean, look, just go read, go read the Commonwealth trilogy or the Conqueror's trilogy, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Or even his Cobra series, or I mean, shit, the stuff he did with StarCraft, like with StarCraft Evolution, phenomenal. Anyway, what we have here is the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy. Now, this is a separate trilogy. Obviously, it's not the Heir to the Empire trilogy, as it's known, or the original Thrawn trilogy from the 90s, that started in 91 with Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising in 92, and then Last Command in 93. No, this is actually no, it's not really a sequel trilogy because he also ended up doing one that I really enjoyed, and maybe some of the best books. Actually, I put the first in this trilogy at the best Star Wars book of the new canon. And that being, there was the Thrawn trilogy that he started in 2017. And again, this is part of the new canon since Disney took over. That being Thrawn in 2017, Thrawn Alliances in 2018, and Thrawn Treason in 2019. Now, while those books, that original Thrawn trilogy for Disney, while that kind of went back and forth in time, like it would go from the Galactic era to the Republic era, and, it'd kind of go back and forth between those. The Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy is firmly set just before the 2017 Thrawn book, which goes, the 2017 Thrawn book covers the time period. That one actually doesn't jump back and forth. It's the other two that do. But the 2017 Thrawn book shows us how Thrawn ended up joining the Empire, like how they found him, how that all kind of came to be. This leads right up to where the 2017 Thrawn novel starts. So in many ways, this is Timothy Zahn's prequel trilogy, which in itself I find interesting, partly because next to George Lucas, and this is part of what makes, in my opinion, Timothy Zahn one of the greatest, authors of all time. Timothy Zahn is so much more in. I could get into a big subject on this. Okay, we could go down roads. In my opinion, and this is an opinion that has kind of grown over time, and especially over the past few years with what Disney's been doing. I dare say Timothy Zahn is more integral to Star Wars' lasting power, to Star Wars, its appeal, to Star Wars fandom than perhaps George Lucas himself. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, the original Star Wars trilogy, which everybody kind of holds up as like, okay, this is what made Star Wars. This is Star Wars, this is Star Wars greatness, and nothing's ever going to top it. In general, I don't disagree with you, okay? But what makes those movies magical? What gives them their power? And I think it comes down to two things. One, and this isn't new, I've said this before. One is its cool factor. Everything is just so damned cool. Okay, it doesn't experience or have the depth of Star Trek or many other works of, space drama. But it just has tremendous cool factor. It created a universe that, as Rob has pointed out many times, as shitty as it is, it's still one you kind of want to live in because everything's so damn cool. Or at least for me. And so there's the cool factor of everything. And then the second part is that it was science fiction, or it was genre film, if that makes you more comfortable. Okay. It's genre film that looks hyper realistic. It looks so good in comparison to anything else made at the time, especially with Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, in 80 and 83. Nothing looks that real. I would almost argue today, still, nothing looks as fucking good as those two movies. Yeah, sure, we have CGI now that can make shit look pretty good. There's design might be bested by some other movies like Dune, the original Dune, David Lynch's Dune, had, just tremendous set design and everything else. But really, movies that look like, wow, I'm actually watching this shit happen. Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi take the cake in genre fiction or genre film. But that's all they have going for them. That's not enough to give those movies the staying power that they still enjoy to this day, other than they still look so fucking good, you know? What I think actually gave Star Wars its staying power, and what I think reinvigorated even, the fans, and what made Star Wars fans the fans that were buying up, like all the action figures and everything else in like 96 and whatever, and what even allowed for the special edition re-releases of the original trilogy to make sense, and what even paved the way for people to frankly be like chomping at the bit for the prequel trilogy, was none other than Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire trilogy, starring none other than Grand Admiral Thrawn, who we're talking about here. Timothy Zahn gave us everything we wanted as Star Wars fans. He added mythology to the Force, more mythology to it. He brought in powerful new characters like Grand Admiral Thrawn that had a lot more going for them. I mean, he essentially brought Sherlock Holmes, into Star Wars. And I would argue Thrawn next to Sherlock Holmes. I mean, because he's a type of Holmes, they say like how Christians say a type of Christ. Well, you have characters in popular fiction that I call type of Holmes, and Batman is a type of Holmes. Thrawn is a type of Holmes, but Thrawn as a villain had a lot more going for him than anybody outside of Darth Vader, as far as backstory and as far as like character development and all of this. I mean, the Emperor totally, existed off of visual cues and what could argue, if you're into it, cool factor, and the cool factor of his royal guards, right? In their red robes. So, and then Thrawn brings, Thrawn, might as well call him Thrawn. But then Timothy Zahn, brings in Mara Jade, even Talon Card. You get more of, what happens to Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan's ghost. He even brought in, I think, one of the lesser recognized, even though I think she was fully realized, characters from the old EU, that being Winter. There's just, and all these like slicing and all these different concepts that we consider a totally normal part of Star Wars that frankly didn't exist until Timothy Zahn himself wrote them. And in many ways, even... hell, what this show's named after, the video game Star Wars TIE Fighter. You watch the opening, movie for that? Who's there, baby? It's Thrawn. And you better believe the game designers were jazzed as shit to make sure that Thrawn was in there, because we all know how cool he is. And if those books weren't so damned good, you wouldn't have had, yes, like West End Games deserves a lot of credit for the old EU, and for building that out and making the Star Wars universe even more real. Part of what makes even, this is the funny thing, is that it's a retroactive effect. Part of what makes the original Star Wars trilogy, I think, so much more than the sum of its parts, also comes down to that the old EU basically took you think of the Tales from Mos Eisley books, or those kind of anthologies. You think of what West End Games did, and they took every little fucking nugget they could out of Star Wars, and they gave it and every little character, and they gave them a backstory. Right now, what Ithorians are. Now about the Shistavan Wolfman, or whatever. And retroactively, it made the original trilogy not just be the most realistic looking, movies, genre films ever made, but then it also gave them incredible depth. But all of that comes down to, yes, again, I gotta give tons of credit to West End Games and the role-playing game. But so much of that came down to Timothy Zahn. And perhaps at some point, somebody talked to Kathleen Kennedy or whoever is in charge of such matters at Disney and said, hey, look, if you want people to take these Star Wars books seriously, you're going to have to get Timothy Zahn. And not like Zahn stopped in the 90s. He was writing, his last book, actually, he was still writing Star Wars books into 2013 when Disney bought it out. I don't think it's not canon, but he wrote the book Scoundrels, which was dynamite. But he was still writing stuff. Choices of One, Allegiance, Outbound Flight. All those are great books. So fortunately, Disney knew what they needed to do. Now, like I said, his first foray, Timothy Zahn's first foray back into Star Wars and into the new canon, came with 2017's Thrawn, the book of that name. And of course, Thrawn would be in Star Wars Rebels, and, we all know what happened there. Perhaps one of the greatest justices, not injustice, but one of the greatest justices of Disney taking over for Star Wars, and I'm not saying there are many, but this is one of them, is that Thrawn is not dead. Okay. And he's not dead well into the future of Star Wars. That is a very fortunate thing, even though Zahn still kind of tried to I don't think he realized how big a deal these books would be. He didn't realize how how people would attach so much to Grand Admiral Thrawn, because of course he did his Hand of Thrawn duology, in the late 90s to kind of bring back the ideals, quote unquote, of Thrawn. And it, it's a worthy attempt, because that's really, for me, what makes Thrawn so great. Not just that he's a Sherlock Holmes character, but that he does have ideals. He does have a logic to him. He has an angle that he is working from and that he sticks to. I don't know if you want to call him a moral character. Actually, after you read Thrawn Ascendancy, that trilogy, you might think so. But anyway, so with 2017's Thrawn, like I said, I think this is the best book of the new canon. And what I love about it is it essentially reads like The Art of War, by Sun Tzu, not Sabzu, but by Sun Tzu, interspersed with some great fiction and great action. Okay. And very clever plotting. And, when I was a kid in third grade, and I'm not kidding, when I was in third grade reading, the Heir to the Empire. And you know how big that book was. Oh yeah. That book taught me how to read, frankly. I mean, or, at least adult books in a very real way. When I was, reading that, and like Thrawn is explaining the reasons behind everything he does, like I'm like fucking taking notes, so I love that about Thrawn. I want, yes, give me the wisdom. Right. And 2017's Thrawn did that. That book did that. Now the following two books did not so much. But they were still very good books. Great interplay between Thrawn and Vader in the last of that trilogy. There's just good stuff going on. Now, the middle book in that trilogy, Thrawn Alliances, explores more of like Thrawn's original encounter while he was still with the Chiss Ascendancy and not with the Empire. His original encounter with General Anakin Skywalker during the Clone Wars. This becomes one of the main reference points for the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy. The Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, so it's 3 books: Chaos Rising, Greater Good, and Lesser Evil. And these all came out over the past 2 years, 2020, and the last two both came out in 2021. I'm kind of surprised they didn't wait on the third book to have it come out in 2022, but whatever, they didn't, and it's just as well. But here's the funny thing with these books, and so now we're going to start talking about these books. The funny thing with these books is there's nothing really at all attaching them to the Star Wars universe other than the somewhat constant mention of, Thrawn's engagement with, or, his interaction with Anakin Skywalker during the Clone Wars. That's the only fucking thing that connects it to anything generally within the Star Wars universe, other than what the previous Thrawn trilogy, talked about with the Griss, which is like this evil, because now with 2017's Thrawn, we know how he ended up joining the Empire, right? And we know the conversation he had with the Emperor saying, hey, there's evils that you haven't even heard from, that are just knocking at your door, and we've got to be ready for them. And you get some well, we'll get into it with Ascendancy, because you get some explanation on that. But this really is the odd thing with these books is, again, there's really no connection, to, they reference the Clone Wars, there's a point in the very last chapter of the very last book of this trilogy where they reference the Confederacy, or, the Separatists. And they reference the Republic falling, and they reference the Galactic Empire coming into power. But other than that, the whole all of these books, the three books in the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, all take place in the unknown regions, or what is in this case Chiss space of the Chiss Ascendancy. And it spends a ton of time going over the very complex hierarchical, authoritarian family system that the Chiss operate under, which if you read them, you'll learn more about it. It's the 40 and the 9. It's all very complex. Timothy Zahn is really great at that, at building out entire worlds and frankly, entire other social orders. I thought that a lot of that stuff was really brilliant. And I mean, there's not a whole lot of point in talking about each of the books separately because they really are so directly connected, one after the other, that they're kind of all one story. It's great. Like, the action is awesome. Thrawn's cleverness is phenomenal. You get some really, really great moments with him. And if you're listening to the audiobooks, Mark Thompson, I think, does a great job. He does especially a great job with Thrawn himself. You get to experience a lot of other Chiss characters, as well as a lot of other species that you hadn't heard of before. And, the whole thing is about them, taking on this other evil in the unknown regions, that being the Griss, or maybe it's even something more. They can always expand upon it. And Thrawn's like machinations in dealing with that. And again, it's complex stuff. It's complex, like family arguments or family matters. We're Steve Urkel. No, did I do that? Oh, anyway. So you find that Thrawn has a sister. I mean, like, there's all this stuff, and you get a look at like a different way because the Chiss access hyperspace in a different way. Or not just access it, they navigate it in a different way than, what you would know of from the Empire or the Republic or the Rebellion. They use a class within their species known as, interestingly, Skywalkers. Now, they don't spend a ton of time explaining that. Thrawn recognizes the mystery, especially because he spent time with Anakin Skywalker, and he's like, well, that's weird that they have that name, and that's how that translates into Chiss. You get some of that, which is kind of cool. You do get the great, funny moment in these books between Anakin Skywalker and Thrawn, which I won't spoil it for you, but we've talked about it before on TIE Fighter Renegades. Of course, it's a moment that's originally in Thrawn Alliances, but you do get it in the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy again. It's just, there's nothing wrong with these books, but then they fall prey to the very same thing that just about every Star Wars book outside of the High Republic books, which that's a completely separate animal that I will be doing a TIE Fighter Renegades about, to say where we're at this stage in the game with the High Republic. Every book outside of the High Republic, it's always the same thing. It's only in the last chapter or so, maybe the last couple chapters, or hell, it might even be the epilogue. It's only at the very end of the book. Not that you get resolution of the story within the book, but that you get anything, any, footnote or any like little bit of information that has any bearing on the Star Wars universe as a whole. And I hate that. I hate that so much, because that was the beauty of the Heir to the Empire trilogy that Zahn wrote in the 90s. It was like you had 3 massive books that built out so much history and so much facts. And, it's like it just fleshed out the Star Wars universe so much. And none of the Star Wars books in the new canon really do that until you get to the last chapter. And even then, it's usually just something small. And I am so sick of this. And I know, or I think I know, why Disney's doing it. Disney's doing it because they in their infinite stupidity felt that, okay, we got to make everything canon so that everybody will buy anything. Otherwise, they just won't care anymore, because we wiped out, the old EU on them. But because everything's canon, like, things that matter can only be like little sentences at the end of the book. We cannot flesh out the Star Wars universe, not really. Or at least not in a way that has impact on the entire universe. Sure, they can make a million new characters, they can introduce a million new species and all this stuff, but as far as having impact on the grander concepts of Star Wars and what makes Star Wars, yeah, no, they're just constantly, they're just watering it down all the time, and they're barely adding anything. It's fucking annoying. So what gets added in here? Okay, so I'll tell you what the crown is of this trilogy. So this all culminates in, because if you haven't picked up on this, I'm basically saying, unless you just really love the character of Thrawn, again, 99% of what happens in these books has no meaning for the Star Wars universe as a whole. None. It can sit completely on its own. Like, it doesn't even, like I said, it doesn't even need to be Star Wars, other than two, like the couple mentions, you get to kind of relive like his introduction to Anakin Skywalker, which could easily be stripped out of the book and doesn't mean anything. And you get some reference to like reports that they have that, though, there's this galactic empire out there and all this stuff. Otherwise, again, there's nothing fucking Star Wars in this whatsoever. It could be a completely separate universe that's just the Chiss Ascendancy. But anyway, to play in with the larger Star Wars universe, all you get is at the very end of the third book, and these are big books. At the very end, you find out why Thrawn was exiled. And I don't think it surprised anybody, and really it didn't surprise me. You essentially find out he was exiled by his choice. Like, it was a plan for him to try and gather intelligence and allies to help the Chiss Ascendancy, which is who he ultimately serves, in fighting off, this new grand evil that exists in the unknown regions. And in particular, in this case, it would have been the Gris. But the idea is, like, Thrawn wants to get picked up by the Empire. And he wants to, like, infiltrate that. Either to find out if the Empire itself is a threat, or, again, to find allies, which, when you read the previous Thrawn trilogy for Disney that Timothy Zahn wrote, he does grab allies, right? Like his second in command, he sends off to the Ascendancy to help out, and he's been, like, slowly funneling people to the Chiss Ascendancy to help out there. But effectively, you have, like, Thrawn is, and the Ascendancy, like the 40 and the 9, don't really know, like the government that makes up the Ascendancy, which is separate from the military in ways. The Ascendancy, they want a scapegoat for this disaster, like this crazy war between a couple different alien species that happens during this trilogy. Okay. And that Thrawn is navigating throughout the whole thing and creates the bulk of the action. They want somebody to pay for that, for the, the bad look, because the Chiss Ascendancy has, like, a non-interventionist policy. And so Thrawn ends up being, the scapegoat, for this. And he's the whipping boy. He's the one that they blame, and he gets exiled. But you find out at the very end that, well, it was actually all part of the plan. And, I want to say that there's points in this where, like, Thrawn is just too clever. It's like, okay, yeah, he's clever, but, like, he never really loses. And there's a problem in that. Like, at least in the Heir to the Empire trilogy from the 90s, like, Thrawn was still somewhat fallible. He was that good, but he could still kind of flub here and there. And I felt like, and certainly I think he flubbed in even Zahn's previous Disney Thrawn trilogy. He's just way too good in this. And that comes off, a little disingenuous, or a little unbelievable. And in one sense, the ending of this trilogy is essentially saying that, well, Thrawn is actually a good guy. Like, he's trying to protect the Chiss, and he actually likes other species, and he's, like, trying to protect so many people from these, grander, darker powers. And, it makes me wonder what they're going to do with Thrawn. When we get the Ahsoka series, how is Disney going to play him up? Is he really going to be the villain, or is he going to be, is he going to be redeemed as this good guy because he is such a popular character? So there's a part of me that doesn't mind it, But then there's the part of me that's like, doesn't mind him essentially being a hero and a very moral character. But then there's the part of me that's like, no, well, can we have a villain be a villain? It's like Disney is terrified of a well-developed character like Loki or something from Marvel, right? They're terrified that a well-developed, well-acted, well-presented character is a villain. Like they're terrified that people are going to, I don't know, be seduced by their villainous ways to be villains themselves, which I would argue they're not, right? Most of the time, villains in a lot of fiction in general are just egoists, and I don't mean to get conspiratorial. I feel like the entertainment industry and the news industry, they're all the same. They're all entertainment. None of it's real. I feel like the entertainment industry is, the larger, the more mainstream, is just terrified of people of accurately displaying villainy and people realizing that the very people involved in the entertainment industry in real life, the people in Washington, the people in, pick your den of iniquity, are just that they're villains. I think they're terrified for the masses to find out that, well, everybody on top are, they're just egoists. They don't want people to come to this conclusion. And so I get this sense, all of that said, again, can't prove all of it, but all of that said, I get the sense that Disney's like, oh shit, Thrawn is so popular, we've got to turn him into a hero because we cannot have popular villains. We cannot have ships named Slave One. Whoops. Did I say that? I'm sorry. We cannot. Oh man. At least George Lucas left the morality. You think of the Mortis trilogy, right? At least George Lucas is just the morality. He's like, well, it's shades of gray. At least he was honest. But Disney, oh fuck no. No, they can't have that. And actually, I've been reading something recently where I think I can now finally, explain the Mortis trilogy. Everybody on YouTube has it wrong. And I know it for a fact because there's a name, and it's not a Star Wars name. It's a real life person that existed in the 20th century. There is a name of a quote unquote philosopher, and really was much more, that his philosophy, as it were, completely explains the Mortis trilogy. And I think George Lucas actually read this guy a lot, and it makes a ton of sense. Actually, a lot of Star Wars makes more sense once you see it through the lens of this guy. But that's an episode for another time. But I do feel better that now I can actually understand the Mortis trilogy. Granted, what George Lucas meant by it, because now, how the story was supposed to conclude, we know that we don't know how Star Wars was supposed to conclude because Disney threw out George Lucas's scripts for 7, 8, and 9. But anyway, the lesson of these books is that Thrawn isn't really a bad guy, which, it really doesn't make any fucking sense. It just does. Because this guy's still wiping out rebels right and left. You got to answer for that unless Disney wants to admit, which they won't, that's the whole problem, unless Disney wants to admit that the Rebel Alliance is a bunch of terrorists, and in the conventional sense of existence, citizenry under a government, the Galactic Empire is not the bad guy. But you're not going to get Disney to admit that one. Anyway, so more thoughts on this book. So there you go. That's the end of it. And that's essentially what you learn, and that this concern that there's things out in the unknown regions. It's not just the First Order. There's other shit out there, and they'd probably make really great villains post episode 9, or maybe they would. Because you're barely getting introduced to them, that being the Gris in this Thrawn trilogy. But it'd be another situation where Timothy Zahn, admittedly is setting the stage for what's to come, after a trilogy of films. So, other thoughts here. There's, again, in so much as these are so loosely connected to Star Wars proper, it's and Timothy Zahn said this before with the first book, and we talked about it on TIE Fighter Renegades. He made the claim that even if you don't like, what Disney has done with Star Wars, and you're more into the original trilogy, and you're into the, original trilogy and the Thrawn trilogy, you can still enjoy these books. He is 100% accurate on that, because there's, even the moments you get with Anakin Skywalker, there's nothing within this. Everything's so vague. There's nothing within this that contradicts the original trilogy, that contradicts the Heir to the Empire trilogy. Actually, nothing in it contradicts the prequel trilogy. But then also, because it's so removed from Star Wars, it also doesn't contradict anything Disney has done previously. So it's funny how you could even be a fan that doesn't like the prequel trilogy, and these books still fit into canonicity, no matter what trilogy you actually consider to be canon. Movie trilogy you consider to be canon. And just based on what Timothy Zahn said, even around the first book, I can't help but think that was intentional. And for me, hold on, before I go on that, tangent. So the problem there is that because nothing's happening, for me, that's actually a problem, because there is no grander effect, at least not yet, on the broader Star Wars universe. They're books that, okay, yeah, I got more Thrawn, and that's great, and it really is, but at the same time, give me more. I want some connective tissue here, and I want answers to things, but Disney has no interest whatsoever in providing any kind of answers. Everything has to have trapdoors and workarounds and loopholes and all this other stuff, so that they can essentially allow any writer, director, whatever, that they can come in and make whatever bullshit they want, and somehow they'll squeeze it into, Star Wars, even if eventually they have to go with the nuclear option of the world between worlds. And that annoys the fuck out of me, because clearly we are still largely dealing with a lack of vision, to quote the Emperor. And we're paying the price for that lack of vision at Disney. They just want to make everything as vague as they fucking can so they can still sell it, and whatever flavor of the month they want to bring in as far as a creative, director, writer, whatever, can still do whatever the fuck they want and not have to know the Star Wars story. But then, we as Star Wars fans, we got to fucking know everything. We got to know. And that's so ass backwards. We're not supposed to know everything. The people making the movies and the books, they're supposed to know everything, and they're supposed to take us on the primrose path, so that when the big galactic event happens, we didn't see it coming, but we should have, because it was planned the whole time. So, it's the kingdom upside down, as the Christians say. In this case, the Disney kingdom. So there's not a whole lot of point to you reading this book. You can very well just go and get a Wikipedia entry on the new canon version of Thrawn. You'll find out why he really joined the Empire, and why he was really, banished, from the Chiss Ascendancy. And I can accept the answer. I'd like a better one, and I guarantee this was not the answer that Timothy Zahn thought of, back in the 90s or anything like that. No, there was something else going on in his mind back then, but, I'm sure he had his directives from Disney as well. So these books are very good. They're great Timothy Zahn writing, but at the same time, for the larger Star Wars universe, they mean jack shit. Now, the nice thing, on the other hand, though, is largely, you could, like I said earlier, you could fit these into any Star Wars canon that you want. Meaning, again, if you only like the original trilogy, they can fit in with that. If you only, because even what they tell you about Anakin Skywalker doesn't go into too much depth. If you, only like the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, they can easily fit into that. And if you like the sequel trilogy, they still fit in with that just fine. And might point at what's coming next. And the reason I bring this up is my headcanon, and I hate that concept, but, corporations that buy up these IPs, that buy up these franchises, are not living up to being good stewards of them. I mean, look, there's great shit going on in Star Wars. Make no mistake about it. You know, Book of Boba Fett, Mandalorian, obviously, Bad Batch, you know, all that, and, you know, expanded stuff with Clone Wars, all that shit's great. Like I mean that, like, it's good stuff. Okay. But, and it's not nostalgia here, but it's subpar to, I think, much of the scale and the consequences of what was happening before. And not just what was happening before Disney bought it out, but even before the prequel trilogy. I think Star Wars, if there was a third pillar of Star Wars, right, there's the cool factor, realism of presentation. If there was a third pillar, it would be the mystery. And while this might sound contradictory to what I was saying about having a problem with everything being so vague, it's not. Okay. The problem with the vagary, is that a word? The problem with Disney's vagary is there's no consequences. Okay. It's not because it generates mystery. It's because there's no consequences. Mystery is a wonderful thing in storytelling. And I think mystery was always Star Wars' third pillar. And I dare say, and I've been a defender of the prequel trilogy since 1999. Okay. But, you know, my headcanon in my mind, like, I think the prequel trilogy shattered that third pillar of mystery, and not in a good way. Like, it didn't give us the answers we were looking for. You know, I think people are completely accurate when they say, I mean, and look, I love episode 1. I really do. Okay. On its own. But when people say that, okay, no, the prequel trilogy should have started with episode 2, and, you know, like, that should have been episode 1, maybe a different movie, because a lot of people don't like that movie. But you get what I'm saying, is that it should not have started with Anakin Skywalker so young. We should have gotten to, you know, we should have experienced him, frankly, much older than he ever got to be. And I can agree with that. But I guess what I'm ultimately getting to here is just decades later, in my headcanon, frankly, fuck everything Disney's done. Fuck the prequel trilogy. Like, you know, they just, I mean, none of this stuff has lived up to what the original trilogy did, which, you know, we could get into arguments how much of that was even really George Lucas as compared to how much of it was Lawrence Kasdan or Gary Kurtz or whatever. And none of it's really lived up to what the Thrawn trilogy did, or even, you know, and fuck, it's amazing. I mean, Disney basically copied this, you know, like what the Dark Empire trilogy did, you know, by Dark Horse, right? With Dark Empire 1, Dark Empire 2, and then Emperor's End. Yeah, that's the thing. Like, there was this magical little few years in the 90s, not unlike the time between, you know, 77 and 83 for the original trilogy, where just the most awesome shit was happening in Star Wars, and everything felt very interconnected. Even though you had different creators involved, it seemed like at least people were talking to each other in some way. And so for me, you know, my headcanon, especially in the past year, has really just been, okay, the original trilogy of films, the Heir to the Empire trilogy, you know, the Dark Empire trilogy, like, yeah, Crimson Empire. I love both of those. The Tales of the Jedi series, which that's a great way to do Star Wars without having to, like, really, you know, hurt, or, you know, get involved with the characters of Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and whatever. But the Tales of the Jedi series, you know, the Jedi Knight games with Kyle Katarn, awesome. The story, you know, the story in Dark Forces of how they got the Death Star plans is killer. Great story. You know, the X-Wing and TIE Fighter games, I put those in that number. Shadows of the Empire, right? The Ewok movies, those used to be considered canon, more or less. Hell, even the Droid and Ewoks cartoons. Splinter of the Mind's Eye, I like that. I mean, fuck, it's Alan Dean Foster, man. I like that book fine. And, you know, like, yeah, the Knights of the Old Republic games. But, like that's essentially my headcanon. I mean, yeah, I know there's lots of other stuff, right? Like the Jedi Academy trilogy, the Black Fleet Crisis, you know, I know I've read them all, right? Or even New Jedi Order and all that stuff. Yeah, whatever. I mean, the X-Wing books were good, but all this, nah, you know, like novels wise, I feel like, you know, it stopped with the Heir to the Empire trilogy, and they could have just stopped right there. And the comic books, you know, did some really cool shit. Like I said, with Crimson Empire, Tales of the Jedi, and Dark Empire. But like, again, if Star Wars stopped at the end of The Last Command, great. Well, I guess Crimson Empire goes a little beyond that. But if it stopped there, great. We got a nice package here, guys. And you don't even need the prequel trilogy. You don't need it at all. And that's it for me. And you know what's amazing? Because I can go back, everything I just listed off, I can go back and play or read over and over and over and over again. And it's dynamite. Like, it's all just awesome stuff that you can read or play as much as you could watch the original trilogy of films. And I think that's, for me, that's kind of the metric of great canon. Is it something that you just want to keep reapproaching? It's not just like this tidbit of information that I got from reading this 500-page book and, oh, okay, that's nice. And I walk away. Like, it's something that I just want to keep going back to. In that headcanon that I just listed, you could easily put in the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy. Not so much the Thrawn trilogy, like that Timothy Zahn did previously, but the Thrawn Ascendancy specific trilogy can easily fit into everything I just talked about and doesn't cause a problem anywhere. If anything, it becomes even more meaningful because then just the slight mentions of Anakin Skywalker, you're just like, ooh, what's that about? We don't know anything about this Anakin Skywalker. That's cool. And there's just so much more meaning there. And then you can add a lot of context to the Heir to the Empire trilogy, where, Luke Skywalker and everybody's so worried about Thrawn and Luke not realizing that he had interaction with his father, it could add whole new layers of context to that. So I'm open to that being a part of it. And there's a part of me that both hates and loves, there's a part that hates and the part that loves that Timothy Zahn wrote these books in that way. But the reason that they don't excite me too much, they excite me because it's more Thrawn. I'll take that. But they don't excite me too much because, really, I can't tell you how many times I've reread Shadows of the Empire. I can't tell you, and Shadows of the Empire Evolution, even the sequel comic to that, which I would include in my headcanon. Like, or the Tales of the Jedi comic books, Ulic Qel-Droma, Nomi Sunrider, Exar Kun, Mandalore, real Mandalore. Like, fuck, man. I've read that shit over and over again, even in recent years. Can never get enough. Or Dark Empire, man, that is just haunting stuff. Crimson Empire, that understood Star Wars cool better than just about any other comic, I think, actually. And this doesn't appeal in that way. The Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy doesn't appeal in that way. It's not bad. It's done by the master. It's done by Timothy Zahn. And it can fit anywhere. But it loses something in that there's nothing really concrete or like deeply meaningful in it. And also, again, I do think that why Thrawn, was banished from, excommunicated essentially from the Chiss Ascendancy. Yeah. I don't know, that part actually like really hurts. While you could add context to Heir to the Empire, I think that ultimately hurts, the Heir to the Empire trilogy. So forget it. Anyway, that's it for my review. I know I spent a lot of time talking about things kind of extraneous and outside of that, but it's been a little while since we've done a TIE Fighter Renegades, and a lot of shit has happened within Star Wars, and I've certainly had a lot of thoughts about it. And I'm sure Rob is going to have a lot to say when he gets back on. So I will wrap up this episode of TIE Fighter Renegades here. It is good to be back. Check out this books if you really love Thrawn that much, but otherwise, go to Wikipedia. It's kind of a pass. Anyway, that's it. I'll see you on the other side.